Good evening to all of you. I must begin by thanking Adrian Keller, Chairman of the Asia Society, Switzerland, and Nico for inviting me to be here at Zurich. This is my first time. And I also wanted to thank Leni Robredo, Vice President, for starting us off with those thoughtful remarks. You know, I've been pinching myself last 24 hours since I've been here. If I've come to Europe all the way, I mean, I would rather have talked about Europe. In a way, Europe is in the middle of an extraordinary crisis for the first time since the Second World War. I mean, though I make a living by writing and speaking about Asia, I'm deeply fascinated by and troubled by what's happening in Europe. But one of my own conclusions this evening is, I think what happens in Europe matters to Asia, and Asia will matter more and more to Europe. So I think we are here in a world where, when we think about the Ukraine crisis, we also think about what's happening in Taiwan, what's happening in Asia. So I think we are in the same boat. And my sense is we're no longer two separate continents as traditionally we come to believe. And I believe that we're going to be a lot more interconnected. What happens in one part of one theater is going to increasingly affect the other theater, and hopefully we can learn from each other, and we can also find ways of working together. What I thought I'll do in the next 20-odd minutes or 25 minutes is really to highlight four broad themes of what's happening in Asia. When I think Asia has moved from the triumphalism just a few years ago, but Asia is rising and West is in decline. I mean, if you're in even a better mood, I mean, from that kind of a rhetoric, self-congratulatory, triumphalist moment, I think we've reached a point where a lot more somber reflection of where we are, and that Asia's rise carries with it a number of problems. So I think we'll talk about that shift that has taken place in Asia. Second, I also want to break down a false paradigm that has grown. I mean, those in the East as well as the West. This is somehow between East and the West. This between Asia and Europe, or, this has been a classic trope for many people in both the continents. But I want to kind of break that down and see the paradigm is a lot more complicated. This is not East versus the West or Europe versus Asia. There are many fault lines within Asia which intersect with what's happening in Europe and the West. So therefore, this is an interactive dynamic that I would like to highlight. A third aspect I want to talk about is really the Asia's fragile institutions. I mean, we're getting close to having an alphabet soup, like Europe, but the quality of the institutions that we have are not the same. And Asia remains, despite the proliferation of regional institutions, it remains an under-institutionalized area. And I think that carries with its own problems. And within all this, we're beginning to see tension between old institutions, like the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and new institutions, like the Quad, or the Quadrilateral Security Forum, the AUKUS, and the other forums that are beginning to emerge. And the fourth part I want to talk about is really to talk about the interconnections between why Europe and Asia are going to be increasingly related to each other, and some of the new ideas that we've been hearing from the US, how it sees, if you read the national security strategy the Biden administration has put out, it frames quite explicitly what the US wants its Asian allies to do more in Europe, and it wants its European allies to do a lot more in Asia. And I think it is that sense for the first time in the US that these two theaters must be imagined, just as the Indo-Pacific imagines two seas together. We must also imagine these two continents as one single space in which the new challenges begin to emerge. So let me start with the first theme, which is really Asia's rise. Just even 4 or 5 years ago, shall we say, now we can say with some definitiveness, since the arrival of President Xi Jinping, the sense that, the unbridled optimism about Asia's future. From that, I think we're beginning to hit a bit of pessimism today. Because I think three broad factors have changed the structure of Asia's continuous rise, and that the irrevocable, irretrievable rise of Asia was the framing that had become so dominant. But if you look at Asia today, I mean, I think Asia's rise has been uneven. I mean, Asia did not rise all at the same time. Japan had begun to rise in the 19th century. It asserted itself in the 20th century. Then we saw the ASEAN, the four tigers, emerge as major economic forces. And then China's transformation actually created conditions for extraordinary change. That it's today, in 30 years, it's the second largest economy with the greatest influence on international economy in the last 3 decades. But that, I think, the way China's own changes, we'll talk about it briefly, that it is producing a new pessimism about this rise and how this will play out. I think the three factors responsible for this transition from an optimistic phase to a pessimistic phase. One, we have the return of the great power rivalry. For nearly 40 years, once Nixon went to China, US and China became friends. Russia was never a big player in Asia. I mean, it was there in the Cold War. But I think once the US and China came together, you had actually an extraordinary moment in Asia. For nearly 40 years, these two giants were friends, economic partners, and this produced a period of great stability, great prosperity for the entire region. The region benefited from integration with China and the US at the same time, and that's why you had the concept of Asia-Pacific, of this fusing across the Pacific, as well as Asia's own internal integration around China. But today, the US and China are not on the same side, and we're just at the beginning of a confrontation between the two major powers in Asia, and that is just, the consequences are just beginning to unfold. And then China's own problems with the second and the third largest economies in Asia, with Japan and with India, have grown sharply. So therefore you have, for the first time, a contestation between the major powers of Asia, and I think my sense is this is going to be around for a while. The other factor that is causing a big change in Asia is the, shall we say, second thoughts on globalization. That it was believed, I mean, until recently at least, globalization was irreversible, and it's only history has ended. Is all you needed was to simply do more of the same. That we're going to have more and more globalization in the region. But today, I think that trend has reversed. Certainly in the US, the way US thinks about globalization. Free trade is a bad word in the US, and you don't hear much of it in the US. And China, which is the other country that had actually been a great champion of globalization. But it still talks the language of globalization. But Xi Jinping's strategy of dual circulation, of focusing more on the internal economic growth, has actually created conditions for a decoupling, shall we say. I mean, this decoupling is not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a very, very long time. But the fact is, whether you see in terms of, the kind of new movements that are coming, whether Chinese attempts at self-reliance or the American attempt at denying technologies, all those factors are today beginning to play. So I would say then, renewed great power rivalry, second thoughts on globalization, and China's inward turn, together, I think, have produced a different moment in Asia's rise, and we'll have dealing with it is going to be one of the major challenges for us. The second factor on the East versus the West paradigm, that more than 100 years ago, I mean, a Japanese writer called Okakura Tenshin wrote about Asian ideals. I mean, the first sentence of the book, I mean, I see a lot of writers here. I mean, at least when you write a book, you want to do a sentence like this. The first sentence of his book was, Asia is one. Just three-word sentence. Asia is one. That the imagination, as Asia began to liberate itself, began to get a sense of its own self in the beginning of the 20th century. The idea that Asia had so much together, and it was the other of the West, and that Asia had natural tendencies to come together. So this was a great idea that captivated much of Asia. But like all great ideas, I mean, the reality was something different. For all the aspirations of Asian unity, Asian solidarity, ideas that you continue to hear, even from our friends in China, who talk about Asia for Asians. What you have is the inner fault lines of Asia never disappeared. Unlike Europe, where nationalism is a bad word, I mean, Asia, I think we wear our nationalism proudly. All of us, not just China, I mean, everyone is nationalist in Asia. This idea that you can simply, that Asia was going to come together, whether it was the immediate aftermath of colonial movement, that didn't work out. In the last 30 years, it looked like finally what the early leaders like Nehru or Sukarno or Mao Zedong could not achieve. ASEAN, in its simple ways, shall we say, fairly, routine, humdrum activities of economic integration, we're going to produce a regional Asian unity through trade and economic integration. But what we seen is that really that is beginning to break down thanks to the return of territorial nationalism. Lenny talked about, the case in International Permanent Court of Arbitration, where the Chinese claims on the South China Sea were rejected unanimously on every count that China had put forward. But of course, China said, look, I don't accept this process. This is our historic rights. This is not judiciable by courts or somebody else, and the very process they've rejected. And I think this nationalism, today we see that same thing in the Himalayas. And China is not the only one nationalist. I mean, China and Vietnam have problems, Japan and Korea have problems, Vietnam and Cambodia have problems. So the nationalist contestation, territorial disputes, the idea that we can keep them below the surface and we can work together, there was some progress. But in the end, I think today, those contestations are here to stay, and those have not disappeared, making it difficult to develop the idea of Asia as one. Then there is the biggest factor today. While Xi Jinping talks about Asia for Asians, then some of us, who have problems with China, we say, hello, you want to construct hegemony, that you framing your desire for dominance of Asia in terms of universal interest of Asia, just as Japan did. Is really virtually a copy of what Japan did in the 1930s of liberating Asia from Western colonialism, and that Japan would bring Asia together. But then it was linked to the imperial ambitions of Japan itself. So we've seen this story before, and I don't think everyone simply buys in, though it has an attractive slogan of Asia for Asians under the leadership of China. Japan doesn't accept it. India does not accept it. Vietnam does not accept it. So this is today a China that was, say, assuming China had been like Switzerland, just was interested in making money or building an economy. But China wants to be a great power. It wants to be a leader of the region. It wants to be a champion of what it sees itself, its role as a great power. So I don't think anybody can grudge China that role. But then once that ambition has been expressed, others are going to react against that ambition. And that's what we're beginning to see, a backlash against Chinese attempt at constructing an order in which it will nudge the Americans out, and that it will dominate Asia, and that we're simply going to love this because it's an Asians dominating Asians. I don't think Asia is really ready for it, just as Europe was never ready for Europeans dominating Europeans. That brings me to the third set of issues, which is really Asia's institutions, which is that, as I said, look, Asia now has a lot of institutions, ASEAN and ASEAN-centered institutions, ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asia Summit. We have a large number of these forums in the region. But really, those institutions are under real pressure today because of the factors I mentioned earlier of the return of the great power rivalry and the pressure on economic globalization and the resurgence of territorial nationalism. So ASEAN's success came at a time when China was not in the game. India had turned its back on the region, and the US, after the Vietnam War, was quite happy to let ASEAN take the leadership and construct a regional forum. And US-China economic integration, as I said, produced conditions under which ASEAN could emerge as the platform on which the region could talk to itself and generate regional institutions. But the problem is today, a rise of China and its assertiveness are beginning to put great pressure on ASEAN. ASEAN is not united. I mean, all of us say ASEAN centrality. That's part of the mantra, of course. You have to say it. But if there was no, that's also partly true, that if there was no ASEAN, we would have to invent it. But the fact is, when you have a strong power like China, which has its claims on territorial issues, has its aspirations to dominate the region, which I think put enormous pressure on ASEAN. And when you have a strong power, the cracks within the ASEAN are today real. I mean, whether we accept them or not, but they're there. And that is beginning to happen. The fact that ASEAN can't support Philippines on the question of territorial claims, I mean, against where there was a clear rule of law, I mean, that has been established. But I think the power gap between China and ASEAN, I think, produces a situation where it becomes increasingly difficult for ASEAN to really to stand up for its own members. Forget for the rest of the world, for the order, for its own members. So I think there are problems. So what we've seen happen in the last few years, that is the creation of new institutions with American members in it. I mean, the Quadrilateral Forum, which was kind of revived in 2017 with US, India, Japan, and Australia. And now we have the AUKUS. The English are back in the East, and you have Britain, UK, UK, Australia, and US having new alliance on submarine technology and other defense technologies. So suddenly you have actually new forums, and ASEAN is very upset whether these new forums are going to undermine the centrality of ASEAN. But my sense is these forums are not going to disappear. These forums are trying to do what China does, what ASEAN does not do. That is, finding ways to deter China, to limit Chinese capacity for expansionism in the region. Therefore, you have new forums, which I think produce conditions for a more, shall we say, fragmented institutional structure in the region that is beginning to happen. We also have multiple economic mechanisms in the region. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership was supposed to bring much of the region. The ASEAN 10, plus China, plus South Korea, plus Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and India. So 16 countries coming together to form this single economic bloc. But India walked out of it at the end of the negotiations 3 years ago, essentially citing, you would have heard this argument in UK and in the US, that the Chinese dominance in the manufacturing was beginning to hollow out India's own manufacturing capacity. And that India as a large entity cannot simply cede its manufacturing to China. And that China weaponizing this, interdependence that has emerged in the region. We've seen some of that in the pandemic, has led to India walking out of this agreement. And now the US too walked out of the CPTPP. And now US is developing an Indo-Pacific economic framework. It's still yet to be fleshed out in detail, but there are negotiations that are starting. So the trade framework, this idea that you can have a single or one or two economic forums that will bring the region together, one within Asia and between Asia and the Pacific, that I think is now something of the past. So there will be different economic forums. And if the current US policies on chips, artificial intelligence, and other things that begin to happen, there will be two separate cloud systems on which we're going to operate. There is going to be probably two internets. There will be a separation that was unimaginable just a few years ago. So therefore, we're looking at in Asia that the idea of a single architecture for Asia is not going to be with us. So what does all this got to do to Europe? I mean, how does Europe figure in this? For many of us, I mean, I think after the colonial moment came to an end, Europe looked towards its own integration, certainly after 1990. It took some time to send the Europeans home. I mean, the Dutch lingered on for a while, the French lingered on for a while, but eventually Europe left Asia and Americans stepped in to take care of the security, or that became the principal focus of international relations of Asia. And then we've had a European integration post-1990. But now for the first time, I mean, at least some of us in Asia are saying, look, we like Europe to come back. That we can't produce a stable architecture in Asia without Europe's participation. That Asia is too complex, too big. Even the Americans can't handle it. That we need the Europeans back in some form, not in a colonial form, of course, but in a different form where Europe contributes to the security, stability, and prosperity of Asia in a different form. At least for three reasons, I think we need Europe. One, that a bipolarity between US and China, that we don't want in Asia to be at the mercy of the goodwill of the US political class or of the Chinese Communist Party, that the two of them will decide what happens in the region. That having Europe there, not as a third pole, but having as another actor that can bring in a measure of stability in this part of the world would be very, very welcome. I know Europe sees itself as an empire of norms. Sometimes we mock at the empire of norms because what's happening, in many cases where Europe's contribution remains underwhelming. But today, I think we need a normative support to deal with the Chinese expansionism, or to frame at least some broad principles where I think Europe's moral weight, its weight in setting standards, all those will be of value in constructing an Asia that will be stable and can look to the future with much far greater sense of assurance than we do today. And then we need to build a lot of institutional linkages, and I think some of that is beginning to happen. It was Shinzo Abe, late Shinzo Abe, who actually saw, not only visualized the Indo-Pacific, the two oceans being connected, saw the importance of drawing in European powers into the Asian region through the idea of actually engaging France and Britain, the two major military powers, into Asian security issues. Then we saw, once the US framed the Indo-Pacific, we saw more and more European countries beginning to take interest in the Indo-Pacific. We've seen documents come out from most countries in the region, and most recently, in spite of the Ukraine crisis, the last NATO summit actually invited Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, and to participate in the NATO summit. This is the first time Asian leaders were invited to participate in a NATO summit. So I think this is where, as I said, look, the US national security strategy talks about the interlinkage between the two theaters, and that we need US friends and partners working with each other to be able to stabilize this region, especially because today China and the US are allies, strategic allies. This idea that China or Asians play no role in Europe, I mean, that is now no longer true. It was never true, actually. I mean, even if you go to the colonial age, I mean, I think the role Asia played in the intra-European conflicts, right from the beginnings of the colonial age, is always underestimated. But my sense is today, given the crisis that's already in Europe and the crisis that is building up in Asia, it is that integration, it is that connections between Europe and Asia we need a lot more, that we need a lot more interest in Europe to look beyond very confined, provincial, shall we say, approach to international affairs to one of taking greater interest in Asia. And for Asia, to work with European partners, because we cannot construct, as I said, a stable Asia without the participation of European powers, and we can't simply leave this to the goodwill of Washington and Beijing. So therefore, I would say that we're going to have a lot more to do with each other in the years ahead. And I want to congratulate Asia Society Switzerland. I'm a newbie into the family, but I would love to keep working with our friends here, with Europe, to see how we can build this agenda of getting greater awareness of Asia into Europe and drawing Europe into Asia in a more sustained, integrated way in the years ahead. Thank you. Thank you for your patience.
We're going to talk up here for a little bit, but I want to leave enough time also tonight for all your questions. So please keep those ready, and we'll be sure to address as many of them as we can. I have to start though by admitting something, which is that, we've been preparing for this for almost a year, and I have to be very honest with you. There were times when this idea of talking about the state of all of Asia in like a 25-minute keynote seemed somewhat absurd. And I think, Raja, you've proven that it's actually possible, and it was brilliant, and it was insightful, and it was helpful. I'm so happy that we have you here, and I do think there's value in sort of looking at the entire region and asking these big, broad questions instead of just always looking at just part of the picture. So thank you for doing that, and I think for setting us off. I have about 1,000 questions, and I'll try to ask the 400 or 500 most important ones in the next 20 minutes or so. I'm going to start, because you've just proven to us so well how well you can deal with sort of these big interconnected questions. I'm going to start with a somewhat theoretical question, but one that's been on my mind, and it's really been somewhat of a recurring theme, sometimes a recurring joke at the Asia Society Switzerland office. Given your point that Asia and Europe are sort of starting to become a lot more connected, and you said, there's not two separate continents anymore. How useful is Asia as an analytical framework still? Does Asia even exist? Where is Asia? Does it make sense for us to kind of slap this like one label at a region that has more than 50 countries that are very heterogeneous? Is it? And we're aware, like, two people sitting up here who work for an organization that literally has Asia like in the name. So for us, this is an existential question. Like, should we still talk about Asia?
I think so, because, it's, you don't, the levels at which you get deeper into it. I mean, Europe never could figure out where Europe begins and where Europe ends. I don't know if Russia is part of Europe. I don't know if many of you agree with that. So Europe too, I mean, that Asia too, I mean, was also, there's no agreement within Asia. If you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, when ideas of Asian unity first came, and there was no agreement on what constituted Asia. Among the Asian nationalists, was Turkey part of Asia? Was Australia part of Asia? Recently, our foreign minister said Australia is a resident power, though it is a colonial settler country. So I think Nehru, when he convened the Asian Relations Conference, he invited Australia and New Zealand to come to the conference. He had Turkey there. So then Asia became Afro-Asia. Then it became third world, non-aligned, blah, blah, blah. So I think, but the problem is you have to eventually, for analytical rigor, you need to break up regions. I didn't use one word with deference to European sensitivities. I have Eurasia, which is our Russian friends popularized, the notion that, the former Soviet Union space was one single space. But Europe and Asia too are interconnected. We don't have to use the term in the way, Russians use it. But it is still, there is a continent that is interconnecting. I know Bruno has written a whole book on it. The rise of this interconnections, because these were never fully separate. So it's the geography is not what a school teacher tells us, to neatly separated continents and seas. The regions evolve for political, economic, and historical circumstances. So they shrink, sometimes they expand. So I think that's part of the process where a rising China has transformed Asia. But a China and India that were inward-oriented produced different conditions under which it was dominated by ASEAN. So I would say regions are constituted, they're political categories. But to analyze, I can say, look, Europe, and then I talk about whole of Europe. There is Central Europe, there is Eastern Europe, there is Southern Europe. I believe Italians and the Finns don't agree on everything. So there will be differences, but we need to keep these analytical categories with full awareness that there are finite limits to how exactly we can use it. But I think these categories will remain, while some categories are like even Asia itself. If you go back to the Second World War, the term Southeast Asia was not invented till Mountbatten set up the Southeast Asia Command. There was no East Asia till the East Asian miracle. The World Bank said there's an East Asian miracle. So I think these are not all new terms. If you go back to the Second World War, the beginning of the Second World War, there was Japan, there was Nippon, there was Cathay, there was India, there was East Indies, what Indonesia was called. There was all kinds. So there was no single concept, though it was idealistic notions came. So I would say these categories are useful analytical tools, but we should not get too carried away with them.
So now that you've made this important, I think, distinction, let's get carried away a little bit with that concept, because, of course, another, I think, trope that has been discussed a lot is not just, the existence of Asia. I think many people are just taking that for granted, but also this idea that the century we're currently living in is going to be the Asian century. And I think, as very often this is maybe a stronger notion when the century was still very young or hadn't even begun. But now we're exactly 22% into the century. So I think, that's more than a fifth. We can make a first assessment, given what you talked about, sort of this, the fragmentation, the divisions within Asia. Can we still hold to that prediction? Is the 21st century the Asian century?
No, I think like all nice slogans or big ideas, they always have problems the moment you get too close to them. Look, Europe's rise was also accompanied by Europe's intra-European squabbles. The greatest period of European colonialism was also a period of competition, partly outside Europe and partly later inside Europe. So my sense is, look, today the second largest economy is in Asia. The third largest economy, Japan, is in Asia. India, which is soon will be, is the fifth largest economy, is in Asia. We'll discount EU for a moment. We're talking about national entities. But the fact is, you have more growth, you have more economic concentration in Asia. That's going to happen. But as we said, that Asia is not united. And therefore, we need greater interaction with the US and with the West. For example, all this celebration of Chinese technological rise. But who funded it? It was American venture capital. So this notion that somehow Asia has risen autonomously is a political trope. It was never true. The Chinese, initially Japanese, Korean, Chinese access to American market was critical in the making of modern Asia. But today they're big. Today they can generate growth on their own. But the problem is that the US will still matter as the number one economy, as the number one military power. We also want Europe, as I said, to participate in reshaping Asia. Therefore, I think we should not, again, this belief that Asia's rise, the way it was used for a number of purposes, which actually obfuscated, mystified a lot of the internal developments in Asia, and to construct the East versus West paradigm rather than actually explain the importance. Asia has risen, certainly. It has problems of its own, but its ties with the US. The US-China trade, for example, is close to $1 trillion. Europe-US trade, Germans can't shake off the addiction. And so you have actually the levels of integration. Those are also real. It is not that we just grew on our own without the West.
You mentioned that you were seeing a somewhat extraordinary period of 40 years of peace and stability come to an end with the return of great power rivalry. And the question that came to my mind is, was this inevitable? Right? Was this a fluke of history? Was it not just much the end of history, but a fluke of history that was always going to end inevitably? Or was there something that went wrong at a certain point? So could we actually have had this unimpeded, homogeneous, harmonious Asian rise that everybody kind of expected would happen and then didn't? Or was that always just a fantasy?
In retrospect, it's no point looking backwards. I think the idea that, look, things will change. I think there's only one law, which is change is inevitable. The terms and conditions under which the US-China rapprochement took place, immensely beneficial for everyone at that point at the time. But the rise of Chinese great power aspirations and the American fears about a new power rising, which will challenge its dominance, have produced new outcomes. I think that's a new reality. We have to deal with it. There's no point going back and say, look, was it inevitable? But today we are in it, and dealing with it will be one of the biggest policy challenges for the whole region and the world. How US-China rivalry will play out, what it means for Asia, Europe, and others, I would say is the principal question today.
I want to zoom in also a little bit. We don't always have to talk about all of Asia. And I think, of course, one of the key players that you've mentioned a bunch of times besides China is India, which of course you know very well. And I would like to try to tease out a little bit of India's role or India's possible role in all of this. To start, what do you think would be India's or the current government of India's ideal role in the Asia you described? Kind of like, what role does India see for itself? What role does it want to play? And is it realistic that it actually can play that role?
No, the three phases, you can say about India's role in Asia. I thought one was we dreamt of leading Asia. And, going back to the 40s and the 50s, we were going to be the ones. Nehru was, serenading Chauvelai, saying, look, China should not be isolated. We're going to construct an Asian unity. But then within a decade after that, India-China fought a war. And we entered the second phase where India was leaving Asia from leading Asia. We were leaving Asia. India turned its back on Asia, which was really to turn to become bigger Afro-Asian, third world, non-aligned movement, etc. So we turned our back on our Asian brothers. We used to meet them once in New York rather than in the region. And India was economically isolated. So our role in the region shrank. After independence, after the initial enthusiasm. Post-91, you say reconnecting to Asia, where we began to work to reconnect with ASEAN, to become part of the ASEAN-led institutions. But today, I think we're in a fourth phase, which is really, India will now matter because it's rising much slower than China, but it'll matter to construction of a new economic order, of a new balance of power system in the region. And that is where what India does. How does it work to create a stable structure? So it's not just going to be when we joined ASEAN, the advice to us was, look, you guys just shut up. You talk too much. Indians never stop talking. So lie low, don't raise your voice, just let ASEAN do the things. But I think now people tell us, look, you got to do more. The Americans tell us, look, you need to work much more closely to be able to secure the oceans, the maritime security, or give more assistance. We work with Japan, we work with Australia. So I think India is going to be part of what it shunned in the past, of coalitions, of partnerships, of working with others in a far more practical, realistic way, rather than the sweeping notions of Asian solidarity or of third world solidarity, to one of actually building coalitions in the region to limit the dangers of dominance by one power. And I think that's where India is preparing itself, and India does not have the power to do it. Therefore, it's going to work more and more closely with the other Asian partners like Japan and Australia, as well as the United States.
Let's maybe talk a little bit about India's natural partners in Asia, and just kind of two data points that we can use is one is the Quads, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue that you've mentioned a couple of times, which of course includes India, Japan, and Australia and the US, where India is a very active partner, and that seems to work well. And then the other part of the alphabet soup in Asia that you mentioned, sort of with all these institutions, is something called RCEP, which is a free trade agreement, which I think is the closest sort of these institutions, if that's what we want to call it, that covers most of what we usually mean when we say Asia. It covers all of ASEAN, it covers Japan, it covers Korea, it covers China, but it does not cover India. India dropped out at the very last minute. And so can you talk a little bit about sort of, again, sort of where does India position itself? On one hand, strong security dialogue with select partners, some of which are, from within Asia. On the other hand, kind of standing aside sort of in, at least for an alternative, we would have to call it the most important institution for economic integration in Asia.
No, I think as we said, look, I mean, Japan and Australia are still part of the RCEP, because RCEP has 16 countries. That is, you have ASEAN, you have 3 Northeast Asian countries, as well as Australia, New Zealand, and India. So it's really the most representative forum, shall we say, for Asian economic integration. But I think India said, look, it doesn't suit it. It's stepped out. It's trying to negotiate bilateral FTAs. A lot of globalists can question whether it is a smart strategy or not. But the fact is, India simply, it is a politically has decided it cannot be part of the Chinese economic sphere, and that it needs to develop its own manufacturing capabilities. And you can say, look, India is trying to do a China. 40 years late, you could say it's not going to work. But others who think India can begin to produce its own industrial manufacturing capability. But we'll see that. But the fact is, there is IPEF today, which Americans are trying to promote, but there's no free trade in this. It is really of standard setting rather than of tariff reduction. That phase, I think, I think we're beyond that phase. I don't know what the audience thinks. I'm not a trade guy, but I can tell you the notion that you can go back to WTO. If it doesn't work for the number one economy, which is the US politically, if it's also beginning to have problems with the number two economy, we're going to be in a world where the notion that the WTO is like Moses Code, or that is the standard template on which the international economic relationships are going to be managed, I think that's not going to be true. So I think there will be adjustments. It doesn't mean we completely deglobalize, but there will be new ways of rearranging this equation. I mean, more balance between domestic versus uncritical globalization. The US is doing some of that. Europe, I believe, always had it. So I think we're in a new phase. And I think India leaving RCEP is one of them. We still have to see how Japan and Australia are going to work this through as China turns more inwards. But the fact is, right now, the trade with China is not declining because it's so deep for most countries, and I think that will endure for a while. But my sense is there will be attempt to disengage. And some of that, you can see some industries are moving from China to Vietnam to Southeast Asia, some to India. You're going to see some redistribution. But don't see it in the lens of RCEP. RCEP was product of a particular type of thinking. And I think that thinking, is under stress.
Maybe one last question from me for the time being, and then we'll open it up to the audience, because that's something that just was discussed in the last few days. You talked about this idea, which I find incredibly powerful, of Europe and Asia becoming sort of more entangled, of sort of this idea that there's a Europe and an Asia, and there's sort of homogenous entities, but then the connections are also not that strong. It's kind of falling apart, and that Asia has a lot to do with certain things in Europe, and Europe has a lot to do with certain things in Asia. And there was a newspaper article, I believe in the New York Times, just a few days ago, floating this idea that India could be the honest broker for a peace between the Ukraine and Russia. And I thought that was a remarkable idea, right? So that India, as a leading Asian power, would come in and negotiate the European peace. Are we going to see that?
No, I think it's that story in New York Times was a bit overstated. I mean, I don't think India has any illusions of, fixing problems in Europe where Europeans can't fix it themselves. I mean,
I think,
though? Yeah, so I think the story actually pointed to that India did help in the grain deal when they had a problem. It stepped in. So this is a diplomatic process. You can do small things, but the idea that India can tell Russia, look, just go back to where you were, or tell the Ukrainians to stop fighting. I mean, today, New York Times has a nice article called Realists, Optimists, and, Revisionists in Europe. I mean, so Europe, this war is such a big thing. Look, it's not that India can fix the problem, and we can be helpful to the way we can, but rather than overstate. Look, there was a time when we used to believe this stuff. Nehru went to, ran from Washington to Moscow saying the guys settle down to a comprehensive test ban treaty, don't do nuclear tests, is not good for you. Look, I think we were cured of that quite after that. So I don't think there's any illusions. Far more quite realistic. There are ways in which we can help, though India is rising today, more capabilities. But we should not have any... our problem today is to deal with the consequences of the Ukraine war. What it has done to the agriculture, what is food security, to energy security. These are the big issues which for us.
I now realize that one of the conceptual flaw in hosting an event called State of Asia with someone like you is that it can never stop, because every question leads to 10 more questions, and we could talk and sit here forever. I do want to open it up to you, because I'm sure you have many. Oh, yes.